Welcome to another deep dive, and this one is a doozy.
Yeah, you weren't kidding when you said this one was going to be a challenge.
Well, you know our listeners love a good mystery, and this one has plenty. The disappearance of Brian Worley.
And you've given me a whole lot to work with, too. We've got a podcast episode, police reports, even some old news articles.
Exactly. Our listener wants us to, deep dive into it all and try to figure out what happened to Brian back in 2009.
All right, so let's just lay it all out there. What do we absolutely know for sure?
Okay, so Brian Worley, 39 years old, disappears from his parents' home in Carrollton, Georgia, September 24th, 2009.
And we know he was last seen by his neighbors, right?
Yeah, they reported seeing him in the garage around 2:00 in the morning.
Okay, so 2:00 a.m., September 24th, in the garage.
Yeah.
Got it. Now, didn't Brian have a court hearing that morning?
He did. A probate court hearing. And get this, he had actually driven in from Atlanta a couple of days earlier specifically to attend this hearing.
Oh, wow. So he drove all that way and then just, poof, vanished.
Pretty much. And to make things even weirder, he left all of his belongings behind at his parents' house.
Everything.
Phone, wallet, medications, clothes, the whole 9 yards.
And you said we have his medical records? What do they tell us?
Well, the records show that Brian was on medication he needed to take daily. You'd think if he'd planned on leaving, he would have taken those with him.
Right. That does make it seem less likely he just walked away.
And yet, that's kind of what the police initially thought. They were pretty hesitant to even investigate at first.
Really? Why?
Well, they mentioned that 72-hour rule. You know, that thing about how people have to be missing for 72 hours before they'll investigate.
Oh, right. But that's a total myth. I've heard that one before.
Yeah, it is. But it seems like that held things up. Plus, they were kind of fixated on the idea that maybe Brian just left voluntarily.
Did they have anything to base that on?
Not really. They considered things like an affair or problems in his relationship, but there's nothing in the materials our listeners sent that supports that.
Okay, so they didn't have much to go on. What about the actual investigation? Did anything stand out to you there?
There were definitely some oversights, let's call them. For one, the police got thrown off by a water bill payment.
A water bill. How did that lead them astray?
Well, they initially thought it meant Brian was still around after the 24th, but it turned out to just be an automatic refund.
Ah, okay. So
Yeah.
just a mix-up. Anything else?
There were also some beer bottles found in the trash at Brian's parents' house. They were never collected or tested for fingerprints or anything.
That's strange. Why not?
I know, right? His family even pointed them out to the police, thinking they might be important, but they were dismissed.
Interesting. Seems like a missed opportunity. And what about his digital footprint? Did they look into his emails or social media?
Not right away. His niece actually ended up being the one to log into his email looking for clues, and only then did the police ask for his passwords.
Wow. That's a pretty big delay, especially in a missing person case. It's like they weren't taking it very seriously.
Yeah, and his family has said they felt that way too. They even think that homophobia might have played a role in how the police handled it.
That's certainly a concern. Though from what you've told me, there's nothing in the sources that explicitly points to that.
Right, it's just a feeling they had. But then, 3 months after Brian vanishes, there's another twist.
Oh, what happened?
His car is found, all the way up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Abandoned.
Chattanooga. That's pretty far from Carrollton.
About 100 miles, yeah. And someone reported seeing a young black man walking away from the car.
Did they ever connect this guy to Brian's disappearance?
It doesn't seem like it. But here's the thing. Inside the car, they found some of Brian's belongings, including a receipt from September 24th, the day he vanished.
Wait, so the car was in Carrollton that day, then ends up in Chattanooga. That's pretty significant.
You'd think so, but it doesn't seem like the police made much of it. They also found a partial fingerprint in the car, but it wasn't enough to do anything with.
So we have a car, a witness, and a possible connection back to Carrollton on the day Brian disappeared.
That's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. And it just gets more complicated from there. In 2012, they actually assigned new investigators to Brian's case.
Oh, so fresh eyes on the case. Did that lead to anything?
They definitely found a lot of those oversights from the initial investigation.
Like the beer bottles and the delayed email access.
Exactly. They even brought in cadaver dogs to search Brian's parents' property. Did the dogs find anything?
They alerted in the boathouse, but unfortunately no remains were found.
So close, yet so far.
I know, it's frustrating. But then, get this, in 2018, they discovered something else. Apparently, Brian's license plate was scanned by a traffic camera a month after he disappeared.
A month later. Where?
In Coweta County, it's just south of Carrollton.
But if his car was scanned there, why didn't they do anything about it?
That's the crazy part. Nobody seemed to notice the scan until 2018. It's like a whole bunch of what-ifs, you know?
Yeah, I see what you mean. What if they'd investigated more thoroughly from the start? What if they'd looked into those beer bottles? What if they'd acted on that license plate scan? So many missed opportunities.
It's almost overwhelming, right? All these loose ends and unanswered questions.
It is. But I think we need to start by focusing on what we do know. That probate court hearing Brian missed. I think understanding why he was there in the first place might be crucial.
You think it could be connected to his disappearance?
It's definitely possible. It's just too much of a coincidence that he vanishes on the very day he was due in court.
So, what exactly is probate court anyway? And why was Brian involved?
Well, probate court handles all the legal stuff related to wills, estates, inheritances, things like that. In Brian's case, it was about settling his mother's estate. She had passed away a few months earlier.
Okay. So he was dealing with all that while also trying to maintain his life in Atlanta. That's a lot to handle.
Absolutely. And from what I've gathered, there might have been some complications with the estate, maybe some family disagreements.
Interesting. Do we know anything about the judge assigned to Brian's case?
Yeah, it was Judge William Hamrick. And he actually remembers Brian from a previous hearing, just 2 days before he disappeared. He even commented on how Brian had driven all the way from Atlanta, despite some pretty bad flooding at the time.
Wow, so the judge specifically remembers him. That's pretty significant. Did anyone else at the courthouse recall seeing Brian that day?
Unfortunately, the materials you provided don't mention any other witnesses from the courthouse. But there is one thing that stands out.
What's that?
Brian's brother was interviewed for the podcast, and he hinted that there might have been some tension within the family about how Brian was handling their mother's estate.
Really? What kind of tension?
He didn't go into specifics, but he implied that not everyone was happy with Brian's decisions.
That definitely adds another layer to this whole thing. So we've got Brian dealing with the stress of settling his mother's estate. His relationship with Jeff is shaky, and he's having financial problems. Sounds like he had a lot on his plate.
He did. It paints a picture of a man under a lot of pressure. And that makes you wonder, did any of that contribute to his disappearance?
That's a great question. I think to find out, we need to dig a little deeper into Brian's relationships, both personal and those connected to his mother's estate.
Good idea. Maybe there's something hidden in plain sight within those relationships that the police might have overlooked.
Exactly. Let's start with Jeff, Brian's partner. You mentioned earlier that the police considered him a suspect at one point. What made them think that?
Well, for one thing, Jeff was one of the last people to talk to Brian. They had a phone conversation the evening before Brian disappeared, and there were some reports that they had been arguing about Brian's unemployment and some family obligations.
So the police zeroed in on him because of that pre-existing tension.
It seems that way, but there was more to it than that. According to the police reports, Jeff's behavior after Brian disappeared struck them as odd. They thought he seemed detached, unemotional.
But couldn't that just be his way of dealing with the shock and grief? People react to trauma in different ways.
You're right, of course. And it looks like the new investigators recognize that too. They re-interviewed Jeff in 2012 and even gave him a voice stress analysis test, which he passed. Plus, they couldn't find any evidence of domestic disputes or violence between Brian and Jeff in the past.
So it sounds like Jeff was unfairly scrutinized based on assumptions and not any real evidence.
Yeah, it does seem that way. Sadly, Jeff passed away in 2017. Imagine living under that cloud of suspicion for all those years, never knowing what happened to the person you loved.
It's heartbreaking. It really shows you how these unsolved cases can impact so many lives.
The podcast you provided also features interviews with Brian's nieces and nephews. They were very close to him.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
What did they have to say about him?
They described Brian as a really loving and supportive uncle, someone who was always there for them.
Did they mention anything about Brian acting strange or out of character in the weeks before he disappeared?
Not that I recall. They were adamant that Brian wouldn't have just walked away from them, from his life in Atlanta. They're convinced something bad must have happened to him.
Their perspective is so important. It reminds us that Brian wasn't just a name in a police report. He was a real person with people who loved him and miss him dearly.
Speaking of family, I think it's time we circle back to that probate court hearing. We know that Brian's brother wasn't happy with how he was managing their mother's estate.
Yeah, but we don't know any specifics, do we?
No, not really. We know Brian's mother had passed away a few months before he disappeared, and he was named the executor of her will.
And the probate court was overseeing the distribution of her assets, right?
Exactly.
Was there a lot of money or property involved?
They don't say exactly how much the estate was worth, but there are hints that it might have been a significant amount. Enough to cause some friction, at least.
It would be helpful to know if anyone directly benefited from Brian's disappearance. Did the police look into that?
It's not clear from the police reports you gave me. But the podcast host does bring it up as a possible motive, especially considering what Brian's brother said.
Interesting. So we've got possible tension with Jeff, possible family drama over the estate, and don't forget that strange comment Brian made about meeting some interesting people at a bar.
Oh, right. He mentioned that to Jeff during their phone call. Do we know anything about these people?
Not a thing. Brian didn't give any names or say where this bar was.
It's possible it was just a random comment, but it's also possible it could be important. We just don't know.
I guess that's the thing with these cases. You have to consider everything, even things that seem insignificant at first.
Absolutely. Especially when there's so many unknowns, like in Brian's case.
Let's go back to that license plate scan in Coweta County for a minute. It happened a whole month after Brian disappeared, but they didn't discover it until much later. What are the chances that it was actually Brian's car?
That's the million-dollar question. Coweta County is pretty close to Carrollton, so geographically it's possible.
But wouldn't someone have noticed his car during that month? Especially if he was driving around the same area where he vanished.
You'd think so, but we have to consider the possibility that the car was hidden somewhere. Maybe in a garage or on private property where people wouldn't see it.
Or maybe the license plate was stolen and put on a different car. That would explain why nobody reported seeing Brian.
That's a good point. We know his car was eventually found in Chattanooga with his things inside, so if the license plate was stolen, it must have been switched back at some point.
It's also bizarre, and the fact that the police didn't even look into that scan until years later is really concerning.
It makes you wonder what else they might have missed. Sometimes these big investigations get bogged down with so much information, it's easy for things to slip through the cracks.
Or maybe it was flagged, but they just dismissed it as a mistake. After all, they weren't looking for his car in Coweta County at the time.
It's frustrating, because that scan could have been a huge lead. What if they had followed up on it immediately? Maybe they would have found the car, or maybe they would have even found Brian.
It's just another what if in this case, and there are already so many.
You're right. And as more time passes, the harder it becomes to find answers. People forget things, evidence gets lost or deteriorates.
It feels like we're running out of time to find out what happened to Brian.
But we can't give up hope. Even with cold cases, sometimes all it takes is one little piece of information to break everything wide open.
You're right, and that's why these deep dives are so important. By looking at the details, by analyzing the evidence from a new perspective, sometimes we can find those missing pieces.
Exactly. We may not be detectives, but we can still keep these cases in the public eye. Maybe by talking about them, by prompting discussions, someone out there will remember something they saw or heard, something they didn't think was important before.
It's like that saying, the truth is out there.
Exactly. We just have to keep looking for it.
Right.
So let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. We've covered the timeline, the evidence, the possible motives. What are your thoughts on all of this so far?
Honestly, it's just so confusing. A missing person, a messy investigation, a car that turns up miles away, and a license plate scan that appears out of nowhere years later. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
It is. It's complex and tragic. And we can't forget about that question of whether homophobia played a role in the police investigation. Even though we don't have hard evidence of that in the materials, it's still a valid concern.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we always have to be critical of the information we're given and to consider every angle, even the uncomfortable ones.
Agreed. We need to approach these cases with open minds, questioning everything, and always searching for the truth.
So what now? Where do we go from here? What do you think needs to be investigated further?
That's a tough one. There are so many loose ends, but I think we'd start by going back to the witness statements. Everyone who saw Brian in the days before he disappeared, anyone who might have seen his car between Carrollton and Chattanooga, we need to look at everything with fresh eyes.
What do you think we could learn from those statements now after all this time that maybe wasn't obvious before?
Sometimes the smallest details can trigger a memory. A particular phrase, a description of clothing, even a comment about the weather. It could be anything.
So you'd be looking for those little inconsistencies, the things that might seem insignificant at first glance, but could actually hold the key to figuring out what happened.
Precisely. And I'd also want to re-examine the timeline very carefully, especially those hours when we don't know where Brian was. We know he was last seen around 2 a.m., and his car was gone by mid-morning. What happened during those missing hours?
It's the biggest mystery of all, isn't it? Those missing hours. I feel like the answers we're looking for are hidden somewhere in that time.
And even though it's been so long, there's always a chance that someone out there remembers something. Maybe something they saw or heard, but didn't think was important at the time.
It's a long shot, I know, but it's not impossible. People's lives change, their perspectives change. What might have seemed unimportant years ago could suddenly become relevant.
You're right. And with the renewed attention this case is getting, thanks to that podcast and online forums, there's a chance that someone with information will finally come forward.
It's amazing how these things work sometimes. It really does take a community to keep these cold cases alive.
Exactly. And in a case like this, where there are so many questions, any new lead could be the one that finally leads us to the truth.
So, even though we haven't been able to solve the mystery of Brian Worley's disappearance today, I think we've made some progress.
I agree. We've taken a deep dive into this very complicated and tragic case, and we've brought it back into the spotlight. Hopefully, that will lead to something.
I hope so too. And hopefully our listeners now have a better understanding of what happened to Brian, the challenges the investigators faced, and the questions that still remain unanswered.
This deep dive has been a journey through a maze of possibilities. But in the end, it's really about our shared desire for truth and justice.
Brian Worley deserves to be remembered, and his family deserves answers.
And while the road ahead may be uncertain, we can't give up hope that one day the truth will be revealed.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll continue to explore this case and share what you've learned with others.
And if you have any information, no matter how small or insignificant you think it might be, please contact the authorities.
Every piece of information, every memory, every detail could be the missing link that finally brings justice for Brian Worley.
Well, they had a phone conversation, Jeff and Brian, the night before Brian disappeared, and apparently there was some tension there. Brian wasn't working at the time, and there were some family things going on.
So the police were thinking, aha, conflict. Maybe this Jeff guy knows more than he's letting on.
Right, exactly. Plus, from what I read in the police reports, Jeff's behavior in those first few days after Brian vanished, well, it just seemed off to them.
Off how?
They said he seemed detached, not very emotional, which, they took that to mean he was hiding something.
But isn't it possible that was just his way of coping? I mean, everyone reacts to grief and shock differently.
Totally. And to their credit, the new investigators seemed to understand them.
Oh, yeah, the ones who took over the case in 2012.
Yep, those guys. They actually re-interviewed Jeff and even had him do one of those voice stress analysis tests.
Did he pass?
He did. Plus, they couldn't find any evidence of any past domestic disputes or violence between Brian and Jeff.
So it seems like they were just grasping at straws, pinning their hopes on Jeff being the bad guy without any real proof.
It does appear that way, yeah, which is really sad because Jeff passed away in 2017 without ever knowing what happened to Brian.
Oh, wow. That's awful. Imagine living with that kind of suspicion hanging over you and the grief of losing someone you love all those years.
It's a lot to carry, for sure. And it really highlights the fact that these unsolved cases, they don't just impact the immediate family.
Right. The ripple effects can be felt for years by so many people.
Exactly. And Brian's nieces and nephews, they were interviewed for that podcast you gave me, and they were really close to him.
I bet they miss him terribly.
They do. They talked about him being a really great uncle, super supportive, always there for them.
Did they say anything about Brian's behavior in the weeks leading up to his disappearance? Anything that seemed off or unusual?
Not really. They were pretty adamant that Brian would never have just abandoned his life in Atlanta. They were convinced that something happened to him, that he didn't just leave on his own.
It's good to hear their perspective, It reminds us that Brian was a real person, not just a name in a police report. He was loved.
And speaking of family, remember that probate court hearing Brian missed? We were talking about how his brother wasn't too thrilled with how Brian was handling their mom's estate.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Do we know anything more specific?
Well, we know Brian's mom passed away a few months before he disappeared, and he was the one in charge of her will.
So he was the executor.
That's right. And the probate court was basically overseeing the whole process of distributing her assets.
Okay, got it. Was there a lot of money involved? Or property.
They don't say exactly how much the estate was worth, but there are definitely some hints that it was a decent amount. Enough to maybe cause some issues, you know?
Yeah, I can see that. It makes you wonder if anyone stood to gain financially from Brian being out of the picture. Did the police ever consider that angle?
It's hard to say for sure from the police reports, but the podcast host definitely brings it up as a possible motive, especially with what Brian's brother said.
It's definitely worth considering. It just adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Right. So now we've got potential issues with Jeff, possible family drama over money, and let's not forget that weird thing Brian said about meeting those interesting people at a bar.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He told Jeff about that during their phone call. Do we know anything more about who those people were?
Sadly, no. Brian didn't say anything about their names or where that bar was.
So it could have just been a random comment, or it could be a crucial detail. It's impossible to know for sure.
Exactly. It's like that saying, the devil is in the details. We have to be open to every possibility.
Especially in a case like this where there are so many unknowns and things just don't add up.
You got it. Now, what about that license plate scan in Coweta County? That whole thing is just so strange. It happened a month after Brian disappeared, but no one noticed it until 2018. I mean, what are the chances that it was actually his car?
Right. Coweta County is fairly close to Carrollton, so geographically it's possible.
Yeah, you're not wrong. But wouldn't someone have noticed Brian's car during that month? You'd think if he was driving around the same area where he vanished, someone would have seen him.
That's what I thought too. But maybe the car was hidden somewhere, like in a garage or on some private property where people wouldn't see it.
That's a possibility.
Yeah.
Or what if the license plate was stolen and put on a different car? Maybe that's why nobody reported seeing Brian driving around.
That's an interesting idea. But remember, his car was eventually found in Chattanooga, and it had his stuff inside, so if the license plate was stolen, it had to have been switched back at some point.
That's true. It's just so strange that the police didn't do anything about that license plate scan until years later. Makes you wonder how seriously they were taking the investigation, you know?
Yeah, it's like they were overwhelmed with all the information, or maybe they just didn't think it was important at the time.
It's possible. But it's frustrating, because that scan could have been a major lead. What if they'd followed up on it right away? Maybe they would have found Brian, or at least his car.
Another one of those what-ifs that keeps popping up in this case. It's almost too much.
I know what you mean. It's like every time we uncover a new detail, it just leads to more questions.
And as time goes on, the chances of finding answers just keep getting smaller and smaller.
You're not wrong. But we can't lose hope. Even with cold cases like this, sometimes all it takes is one little piece of new information, one new clue, to change everything.
I hope you're right. It would be incredible if we could finally figure out what happened to Brian after all these years.
It would. And you know, these deep dives we do, they're actually really important. By going back and analyzing the details, by looking at things from a fresh perspective, sometimes we can uncover those missing pieces.
We may not be detectives, but we can still play a role in keeping these cases alive, you know? By talking about them, by raising awareness, maybe we can jog someone's memory or encourage someone with information to finally come forward.
That's exactly right. We never know who's listening or what they might remember.
It's like the truth is out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. And sometimes it just takes a little nudge, a little push in the right direction to bring it to light. So let's take a step back for a second and look at the big picture. We've gone over the timeline, the evidence, the potential motives. What are your overall thoughts on Brian's case so far?
It's just so confusing, honestly. We have a missing person, an investigation that seems like it was botched from the start, a car that shows up miles away, and a license plate scan that just appears out of nowhere years later. It's like trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
It's definitely a complicated case and a tragic one. And we can't forget about that question of whether homophobia played a role in how the police handled things. We may not have any concrete proof in the materials, but it's still a valid concern.
For sure. It's a reminder that we always need to be critical of the information we're given and to consider all the angles, even the ones that make us uncomfortable.
Couldn't agree more. We have to keep an open mind and be willing to question everything, always searching for the truth, no matter where it leads.
Well said. So, where do we go from here? What aspects of this case do you think need more attention?
That's a good question. There are so many loose ends. But if I were leading the investigation, I think I'd start by going back to the witness statements. Everyone who saw Brian in the days before he vanished, anyone who might have seen his car between Carrollton and Chattanooga. We need to look at all of it with fresh eyes.
Do you think we could learn something new from those statements now, all these years later, that maybe was missed before?
It's definitely possible. Sometimes memories can be triggered by the smallest details, a specific phrase, a description of clothing, even something as simple as a comment about the weather.
So you'd be looking for inconsistencies, little things that might not have seemed important at the time, but could actually hold the key to figuring out what happened.
Exactly. And I'd also want to go over the timeline with a fine-tooth comb, especially those hours when we don't know where Brian was. We know he was last seen around 2 a.m., and his car was gone by that morning. What happened during those missing hours? That's what I'd want to know.
Those missing hours are the biggest mystery of all. It feels like the answers we're looking for are hidden somewhere in that time.
And even though it's been so long, there's always a chance that someone remembers something they saw or heard, but didn't think was important at the time.
It might be a long shot, but it's not impossible. People's lives change, their perspectives change. What might have seemed insignificant years ago could suddenly become relevant.
That's so true. And with all the renewed interest in Brian's case, thanks to that podcast and online forums, maybe someone with information will finally decide to come forward.
The power of the internet, right?
Huh?
It really can make a difference in these cold cases. It's like a collective effort to keep these stories alive and find the truth.
And in a case like this, with so many unanswered questions, any new lead could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for.
It's amazing how even the smallest detail, the tiniest clue, can change everything. Well, even though we haven't been able to definitively solve the mystery of Brian Worley's disappearance today, I do think we've accomplished something.
I agree. We've taken a deep dive into this really complex and tragic case and hopefully brought it back into the spotlight. Maybe that will lead to some new information. Who knows?
I hope so, too. And more importantly, I hope our listeners now have a better understanding of what happened to Brian, the challenges the investigation faced, and the many questions that still remain unanswered.
It's been a fascinating journey through a maze of possibilities. But ultimately, it all comes back to that basic human need for truth and justice.
Brian Worley deserves to be remembered, and his family deserves answers.
And while the path forward may be uncertain, we can't give up hope that one day the truth will finally be revealed.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the disappearance of Brian Worley. We encourage you to keep exploring this case, share what you've learned, and if you have any information that could help, please contact the authorities.
Every piece of information, every memory, no matter how small, could be the key to bringing Brian's story to a close. Well, there are still so many things we don't know about what happened to Brian that night. We know he was last seen at his parents' house around 2 in the morning, but his car was gone later that morning and all his belongings were left behind. It just doesn't make sense.
It's like one giant question mark. And the fact that he missed that probate court hearing, that really adds to the mystery.
Totally. Why go through all the trouble of driving to Carrollton, especially with all that flooding, and then just not show up?
It doesn't add up. And the more we've dug into this, the less likely it seems that Brian just decided to take off on his own.
Agreed. So, if we're thinking foul play is a possibility, we really need to examine those potential motives more closely.
We've talked about the issues with Jeff, the family dynamics surrounding the estate, and even that weird comment Brian made about those interesting people he met at a bar.
Right. But so far, none of those things have given us a clear-cut motive or a solid connection to what might have happened to Brian.
What about physical evidence? Did they find anything at Brian's parents' house or in his car that could point to a struggle or maybe even an attacker?
Not from what I've seen in the reports.
Right.
No signs of forced entry, no weapons, no DNA that they couldn't explain.
So we're basically left with a lot of speculation and very few concrete leads. It's like Brian just disappeared into thin air.
It's frustrating, for sure. But even in cases like this, where things seem cold, there are always avenues we can explore further.
Like what? What would you focus on if you were in charge of the investigation?
Honestly, I'd start by going back and reviewing all the witness statements. Everyone who saw Brian in the days before he vanished, anyone who might have seen his car between Carrollton and Chattanooga. Everyone. We need to look at everything with fresh eyes.
You think there's something in those statements that might have been missed before, after all these years?
It's possible. You never know what might trigger a memory. It could be a specific word someone used, a description of what Brian was wearing, even a comment about the weather. You just never know.
So you'd be looking for those inconsistencies, those little things that might seem unimportant at first, but could actually help us figure out what happened.
Exactly. And I'd also want to go back over that timeline, especially those hours when we don't know where Brian was. We know he was last seen around 2 a.m. and his car was gone later that morning. What happened during that time? That's the key question.
Those missing hours, yeah. It feels like that's where the answers are hiding.
And even though so much time has passed, there's always a chance that someone out there remembers something they saw or heard, something they didn't think was important back then.
It's a long shot, but stranger things have happened.
Right. People's lives change, their perspectives change. What might have seemed insignificant years ago could suddenly become a key piece of the puzzle.
And with all the attention Brian's case is getting now, thanks to that podcast and the online discussions, maybe someone with information will finally come forward. You never know.
It's amazing how these things work sometimes. It really does take a community to keep these cold cases alive, to keep searching for the truth.
And in a case like Brian's, where there are so many unanswered questions, any new lead could be the one that finally helps us understand what happened.
You're absolutely right. So even though we haven't been able to solve the mystery of Brian Worley's disappearance today, I think we've accomplished something really important here.
I agree. We've delved deep into this incredibly complex and heartbreaking case, and hopefully we've brought it back into the spotlight. Maybe that will lead to new information, new leads. We can only hope.
And hopefully our listeners now have a better understanding of the case, the challenges the investigators faced, and all the questions that remain unanswered all these years later. It's been a fascinating journey, for sure.
It has. A real journey through a maze of possibilities. But at the end of the day, this case, like all the others we cover, comes down to our shared need for truth and justice.
Well said. Brian Worley deserves to be remembered, and his family deserves answers.
And even though the road ahead may be uncertain, we can't give up hope that one day the truth about what happened to Brian will be revealed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the disappearance of Brian Worley. We encourage you to keep learning about this case, to share what you've learned with others, and if you have any information that could help, no matter how small, please contact the authorities.
Every piece of information, every memory, no matter how insignificant it might seem, could be the key to finally bringing Brian's story to a close.